How to make anyone regret disrespecting you. Machiavelli's rules: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power shifted like sand through an hourglass, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a fundamental truth that would echo through centuries: respect is not given freely, but commanded through strategic action. The Florentine diplomat, watching princes rise and fall with the seasons, discovered that those who allowed disrespect to flourish inevitably found themselves crushed beneath the weight of others' ambitions. His observations, born from the brutal realities of Renaissance politics, reveal a path to personal sovereignty that begins with the destruction of one's own weakness and culminates in the establishment of unshakable respect. The foundation of Machiavelli's philosophy rests upon a paradox that confounds the gentle-hearted. To be truly secure from external destruction, one must first become one's own destroyer. This is not the destruction of self-hatred or despair, but the deliberate dismantling of those aspects of character that invite exploitation, disrespect, and domination. The weak self, that collection of fears, people-pleasing tendencies, and desperate need for approval, must be surgically removed with the precision of a master surgeon, for it is this weakness that serves as a beacon for those who would do us harm. When Cesare Borgia swept through the Romagna, consolidating power with ruthless efficiency, Machiavelli observed how the Duke's enemies initially dismissed him as nothing more than a papal bastard playing at war. They disrespected his capabilities, his intelligence, and his resolve. This disrespect, however, proved to be their fatal error. Borgia had already engaged in the most crucial battle of his life, the war against his own limitations. He had systematically destroyed every trace of weakness within himself: the need to be liked, the fear of making difficult decisions, the paralysis that comes from over-consideration of others' feelings. Having conquered himself, he became unconquerable by others. This principle extends far beyond the realm of medieval warfare into the everyday interactions that define our modern existence. The colleague who takes credit for your work, the friend who consistently arrives late and dismisses your time as worthless, the romantic partner who speaks to you with casual contempt, all of these individuals have identified something within you that invites their disrespect. They sense, with the unerring instinct of predators, the presence of your weak self, that part of you that fears confrontation more than injustice, that values harmony over dignity, that would rather suffer in silence than risk the discomfort of enforcing boundaries. The transformation begins with a brutal inventory of these weaknesses. Machiavelli advocated for clear-eyed assessment of one's position, and this principle applies equally to external enemies and internal frailties. You must examine, with unflinching honesty, every instance where you have accepted disrespect. Not the dramatic moments of obvious abuse, which even the weakest among us might recognize and resist, but the subtle erosions of dignity that occur daily, the interruptions during conversations that you allow to pass without comment, the promises broken by others that you accept with resigned silence, the mockery disguised as humor that you endure rather than address. Each of these moments represents a choice, a moment where you either feed your weak self or begin its destruction. The weak self whispers its familiar refrains: "It's not worth the conflict, they didn't really mean it, I'm being too sensitive, I need to pick my battles." These are not the voices of wisdom, they are the death songs of dignity, sung by the part of you that would rather be comfortable in subordination than uncomfortable in the assertion of worth. The destruction of this weak self requires what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the modern sense of moral goodness, but the strength of character that allows one to act decisively in accordance with necessity. This involves developing what might be called strategic indifference to others' approval. When you no longer need to be liked by those who disrespect you, their power over you evaporates like morning mist before the sun. This is not about becoming cruel or callous, but about becoming selectively caring. Your emotional investment becomes a strategic resource, deployed only where it can yield returns in the form of genuine respect and mutual benefit. Consider the person who has learned to master this principle. When faced with disrespect, they respond not with emotional reactivity, which signals weakness, but with calculated consequence. If a colleague consistently interrupts them in meetings, they don't suffer in silence or explode in anger. Instead, they address the behavior directly and professionally, and if it continues, they escalate through appropriate channels while simultaneously documenting the pattern. They have destroyed the part of themselves that needs this colleague's approval, so they can act purely from a position of protecting their professional interests. This calculated approach to dealing with disrespect creates what Machiavelli understood as useful fear, not terror, which breeds resentment and rebellion, but a healthy respect for consequences. When people understand that disrespecting you will result in predictable, proportionate, and inevitable consequences, they modify their behavior accordingly. They learn, often unconsciously, that you are not a safe target for their casual contempt. The second phase of this transformation involves the cultivation of what might be termed dignified unpredictability. While consistency in values and principles remains essential, your responses to disrespect should not follow a pattern that others can exploit. The weak self is predictable, it always chooses the path of least resistance, always prioritizes others' comfort over its own dignity, always makes excuses for others' poor behavior. The strong self that emerges from this destruction operates according to principles rather than patterns. Sometimes this means responding to disrespect with immediate, direct confrontation. Other times it means strategic withdrawal of cooperation or goodwill. Occasionally, it requires the nuclear option of complete relationship termination. The key is that those who might consider disrespecting you cannot predict which response they will encounter, and this uncertainty itself becomes a form of protection. They must consider the possibility that their casual cruelty might result in significant consequences for them, and this consideration often prevents the disrespect from occurring in the first place. The process of destroying one's weak self inevitably involves periods of intense discomfort. Relationships that were built on your willingness to accept disrespectful treatment will face crisis points. Some will adapt to your new boundaries and evolve into healthier dynamics. Others will end, and this ending often comes with guilt, loneliness, and self-doubt. This is where Machiavelli's understanding of necessary sacrifice becomes crucial. The temporary pain of losing relationships based on your acceptance of disrespect is infinitely preferable to the permanent pain of living a life defined by others' contempt. During these transitional periods, you must resist the temptation to return to familiar patterns of weakness. The path of least resistance will call to you like a siren song, promising immediate relief from the discomfort of standing firm. Old friends who benefited from your previous willingness to absorb their disrespect will label your new boundaries as difficult or changed or no longer fun to be around. These accusations are not criticisms to be taken seriously, they are certificates of progress, proof that your transformation is working. The third phase involves the establishment of what Machiavelli recognized as institutional respect, a reputation for consequences that precedes you into new situations. When your consistent refusal to accept disrespect becomes known, it creates a protective barrier that prevents many potential offenses from ever being attempted. People learn to interact with you differently, not because they fear you, but because they respect the clarity of your boundaries and the certainty of your responses. This institutional respect manifests in subtle but profound ways. Conversations with you become more thoughtful, as people recognize that casual cruelty will not be overlooked or forgiven. Professional interactions gain a quality of mutual consideration that was previously absent. Social gatherings where you are present maintain a higher standard of discourse, as those who might otherwise indulge in gossip, mockery, or casual meanness understand that such behavior will not be tolerated in your presence. The beauty of this transformation is that it requires no aggression, no cruelty, no violation of your moral principles. It simply demands the absolute refusal to participate in your own diminishment. When someone attempts to treat you with disrespect, you respond not with matching disrespect, but with the clear communication that such treatment is unacceptable and will have consequences. You become like a well-designed piece of architecture, impressive not because it dominates the landscape, but because it stands firmly on its foundation, weathering storms without bending or breaking. Those who have successfully undergone this transformation often find that they need to defend themselves far less frequently than before. Paradoxically, by becoming willing to fight for their dignity, they reduce the number of fights they must engage in. Potential aggressors, sensing the absence of weakness, simply move on to easier targets. This is perhaps the most profound validation of Machiavelli's insight. When you no longer present as someone who will accept disrespect, people stop offering it to you. The man who destroys his weak self becomes truly indestructible because he no longer provides others with the tools for his own destruction. He has eliminated the internal collaborator that once opened the gates to every invading army of contempt, mockery, and dismissal. Having conquered the enemy within, he finds that the enemies without lose much of their power to harm him. This is not about becoming heartless or cruel. The strong self that emerges from this process is often more capable of genuine kindness and generosity than the weak self ever was, because its kindness comes from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than fear. When you give respect and consideration to others, it carries weight because they understand it could be withdrawn if they violate the boundaries of decent treatment. Your kindness becomes valuable because it is voluntary, not inevitable. Part 1: The Architecture of Respect. Building unshakable foundations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Medici Palace as Lorenzo de' Medici received visitors in his chambers. Among them stood a young merchant who had traveled from Venice, seeking an audience to discuss trade agreements. What the merchant witnessed that morning would later be recounted in letters to his associates, not because of any grand political revelation, but because of something far more subtle and instructive: the way Lorenzo commanded respect without ever demanding it. When a lesser noble interrupted Lorenzo mid-sentence to insert his own opinion, the response was swift but measured. Lorenzo simply stopped speaking, turned his full attention to the interrupter, and waited. The silence stretched until the noble, suddenly aware of his breach of protocol, stammered an apology and asked Lorenzo to continue. No harsh words were spoken, no threats made, yet the lesson was unmistakable. Lorenzo had demonstrated what Machiavelli would later codify: respect is not claimed through grand gestures but through the consistent, uncompromising establishment of standards. The foundation of unshakable respect lies not in how you respond to major provocations, these are often so obvious that even the weak among us might respond appropriately, but in how you handle the microscopic erosions of dignity that occur in daily interaction. These small moments, seemingly insignificant in isolation, accumulate like drops of water that can eventually carve through stone. The person who learns to address these minor disrespects with consistency and clarity builds a reputation that precedes them into every future interaction. Consider the simple act of being interrupted during conversation. In most social settings, this happens with such regularity that it has become normalized, even expected. The weak self accommodates this behavior, often by simply trailing off mid-sentence and allowing the conversation to move in whatever direction the interrupter desires. This accommodation seems polite, even generous, but it establishes a precedent that your words carry less weight than those of others, that your thoughts are less worthy of completion and consideration. The strong self handles this differently. When interrupted, it does not escalate to conflict, but neither does it simply yield. Instead, it might say, with calm clarity, "I wasn't finished with my thought." This simple statement accomplishes several things simultaneously. It identifies the interruption as inappropriate behavior, it asserts the right to complete one's expression, and it does so without attacking the interrupter's character or intentions. The person who consistently responds this way to interruptions soon finds that people naturally begin to allow them to finish their sentences. The interruptions decrease not through fear or intimidation, but through the simple recognition that this particular person expects and will receive basic conversational courtesy. This principle extends to every arena of human interaction. In professional settings, the person who consistently follows through on commitments while clearly communicating consequences for others' failures to do the same builds a reputation for reliability that becomes self-reinforcing. Colleagues learn that promises made to this person must be kept, not because of any explicit threats, but because the natural consequences of broken commitments, loss of trust, exclusion from future opportunities, honest feedback about reliability, are consistently applied. The architecture of respect requires what might be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain centered in your own values and responses rather than being reactive to others' moods, manipulations, or attempts to provoke specific reactions. This sovereignty is perhaps the most crucial element to develop because it removes the primary tool that disrespectful people use to maintain their power over others, the ability to trigger emotional responses that compromise judgment and dignity. When someone speaks to you with contempt, the weak self typically responds in one of two equally problematic ways, either with matching contempt that escalates the situation into unproductive conflict, or with defensive explanations and justifications that signal the disrespect has found its mark. Both responses feed the cycle of disrespect by demonstrating that the aggressor has successfully disrupted your emotional equilibrium. The emotionally sovereign response is fundamentally different. It acknowledges the disrespectful behavior without being destabilized by it. This might sound like, "I notice you're speaking to me in a way that doesn't match the respect I show you. Are you aware of how you're coming across?" This response accomplishes multiple objectives. It identifies the problematic behavior objectively, it maintains your own dignity by not descending to the same level, it gives the other person an opportunity to correct course, and it establishes that you are monitoring and will address disrespectful treatment. The development of this emotional sovereignty requires practice in what Machiavelli understood as the separation of your worth from others' opinions of your worth. This is not about developing indifference to all feedback. Constructive criticism from people you respect remains valuable, but about becoming immune to the emotional manipulation that underlies most disrespectful behavior. When someone attempts to make you feel small, insignificant, or wrong for existing as you are, their success depends entirely on your cooperation with their agenda. This cooperation often happens unconsciously. The person who makes a cutting remark about your appearance, your intelligence, or your capabilities is essentially offering you a choice. You can either accept their evaluation as valid and adjust your self-perception accordingly, or you can recognize their comment as information about their character rather than yours. The weak self almost invariably chooses the first option, beginning an internal dialogue of self-doubt and self-criticism that gives the aggressor far more power than their words alone could ever possess. The strong self recognizes such attempts at diminishment as they occur and responds from a position of clarity rather than reactivity. This might involve directly addressing the behavior. That comment seems intended to hurt rather than help. What are you trying to accomplish here? Or it might involve strategic disengagement. I'm going to step away from this conversation until you're able to interact respectfully. The specific response matters less than the underlying principle. You refuse to participate in your own diminishment. Building this foundation requires attention to the seemingly mundane details of daily interaction. How you carry yourself physically communicates volumes about your relationship to your own dignity. The person who habitually looks down when walking, who takes up minimal space in social settings, who speaks in apologetic tones even when they have done nothing wrong, is unconsciously signaling availability for disrespectful treatment. These physical habits often develop as protective mechanisms in childhood or previous relationships, but they outlive their usefulness and become invitations for exactly the treatment they were meant to prevent. The transformation of these patterns begins with awareness and continues through conscious practice. Standing with full height, making appropriate eye contact, speaking at a volume that can be easily heard without straining, taking up the space you need rather than constantly minimizing your presence, these adjustments signal to both yourself and others that you consider yourself worthy of basic respect and consideration. The changes often feel uncomfortable initially, as they challenge long-standing patterns of self-presentation, but this discomfort is simply the growing pains of dignity. The language you use both about yourself and to others also forms a crucial component of this foundation. The person who habitually apologizes for taking up time, for having needs, for existing in space that others might want to occupy, is programming both themselves and their audience to view their presence as an imposition rather than a contribution. This pattern of preemptive apology might feel polite or considerate, but it actually undermines the respect that genuine politeness is meant to create. Strategic communication involves saying exactly what you mean with clarity and directness, without the cushioning of excessive apologies or qualifications that dilute your message. Instead of "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if maybe you might consider possibly helping me with this project if you have time and it's not too much trouble," the strong self says, "I'd like your help with this project. Are you available to discuss it?" This directness respects both your time and theirs by communicating clearly rather than forcing them to decode your actual request from layers of apologetic padding. The foundation of respect also requires what might be called selective availability, the understanding that your time, energy, and attention are finite resources that should be allocated thoughtfully rather than dispersed indiscriminately. The person who is always available for others' emergencies, who never says no to requests for their time, who prioritizes everyone else's needs above their own, may believe they are being generous and kind. In practice, they are often enabling others' disrespect by demonstrating that their own priorities are always negotiable while others are sacred. This selective availability is not about becoming selfish or uncaring, but about establishing that your generosity is a gift rather than an entitlement. When you consistently drop your own activities to accommodate others' last-minute requests, you train them to view your time as less valuable than theirs. When you regularly sacrifice your needs to meet others' wants, you establish a dynamic where your well-being is considered optional while theirs is essential. The strong self maintains boundaries around time and energy that ensure they can show up as their best self in the relationships and commitments that matter most. This might mean saying no to social events that drain rather than energize, declining to take on additional responsibilities when already stretched thin, or refusing to engage in conversations that consistently leave you feeling diminished rather than enriched. These boundaries are not walls designed to keep people out, but filters designed to ensure that your limited resources are invested in relationships and activities that provide mutual value and respect. Perhaps most importantly, the foundation of unshakable respect requires the development of what Machiavelli understood as internal validation, the ability to maintain confidence in your worth and judgment independent of external confirmation. This internal compass must be calibrated carefully, as both excessive self-doubt and delusional self-regard can undermine your ability to command genuine respect. The goal is not to become immune to all feedback, but to become discriminating about which feedback deserves serious consideration based on the source, the motivation, and the constructive potential. When someone who consistently demonstrates wisdom, integrity, and genuine care for your well-being offers criticism or suggestions, this feedback carries weight regardless of whether it feels comfortable to receive. When someone who has shown little understanding of your circumstances, goals, or values attempts to direct your choices or judge your decisions, their opinions carry correspondingly little weight. The strong self can distinguish between these different types of input and respond appropriately to each. This discrimination extends to recognizing the difference between people who critique your actions in service of helping you improve and those who criticize your fundamental worth in service of their own psychological needs. Constructive feedback focuses on specific behaviors or decisions and offers pathways for improvement. Destructive criticism attacks your character, intelligence, or value as a person and provides no actionable guidance for positive change. Learning to immediately identify and dismiss the latter while remaining open to the former is essential for maintaining both healthy relationships and personal growth. The architecture of respect, once built, becomes largely self-maintaining. Like a well-designed building that requires only routine maintenance rather than constant reconstruction, the person who has established clear boundaries, consistent communication patterns, and unwavering standards for how they will end, will not be treated finds that most of their energy can be devoted to positive pursuits rather than defensive actions. The foundation supports everything else they choose to build upon it, from professional advancement to meaningful relationships to creative endeavors, all enhanced by the confidence that comes from knowing they will not accept treatment that undermines their fundamental dignity. Part 2: The Strategic Response, Transforming Disrespect into Lasting Consequence. In the winter of 1502, as snow blanketed the hills surrounding Imola, Cesare Borgia faced a crisis that would define his approach to power for the remainder of his reign. Several of his condottieri, mercenary captains who had sworn loyalty to his cause, had begun meeting in secret, plotting rebellion against his authority. They whispered among themselves that the Duke was young, inexperienced, and could be managed or manipulated to serve their interests rather than his own. Their disrespect was not born of sudden anger or momentary frustration, but of calculated assessment. They believed he was weak enough to abuse without consequence. Borgia's response would become a masterclass in what Machiavelli termed the strategic application of consequence, a systematic approach to transforming disrespect into lasting lesson that extends far beyond the immediate situation. Rather than reacting with immediate violence, which would have been expected and might have unified his enemies against him, Borgia chose a more sophisticated path. He invited the conspirators to a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation, then systematically eliminated them in a single, carefully orchestrated action. The effect was not merely the removal of immediate threats, but the establishment of a reputation that prevented future challenges to his authority. No one who heard the story would ever again mistake his youth for weakness or his initial restraint for inability to act decisively. This principle of strategic response applies equally to the smaller but equally important battles for respect that define daily existence. The colleague who takes credit for your work, the friend who consistently arrives late to your appointments, the family member who speaks to you with casual contempt, all of these individuals are conducting the same fundamental assessment as Borgia's condottieri. They are testing whether you can be disrespected without consequence. Your response to these tests determines not only the immediate outcome, but your future relationship with this person and, through reputation and observation, with many others. The weak response to disrespect typically falls into one of several predictable patterns, all of which ultimately encourage more of the same behavior. The first is to ignore the disrespect entirely, hoping it will cease on its own. This approach fails because it provides no information to the disrespectful person that their behavior is problematic, leaving them free to continue and even escalate. The second common response is to address the disrespect emotionally, with anger, hurt feelings, or dramatic confrontation. While this does communicate that the behavior is unwelcome, it often makes you appear unstable or difficult to work with, and may actually provide the disrespectful person with entertainment or a sense of power over your emotional state. The third weak response is to accommodate the disrespect while expressing dissatisfaction, complaining to others about the treatment while continuing to accept it from the source. This approach is particularly damaging because it broadcasts your willingness to tolerate poor treatment while doing nothing effective to change it. Those who hear your complaints learn that disrespecting you carries no real consequences, as you will continue to engage with and accommodate those who treat you poorly. The strategic response operates on entirely different principles. It is calculated rather than emotional, consistent rather than sporadic, and focused on long-term relationship dynamics rather than immediate emotional release. When disrespect occurs, the strategic responder first assesses the situation objectively. What exactly happened? What was the likely intention behind the behavior? What response would most effectively prevent repetition while maintaining their own dignity and advancing their larger goals? Consider the workplace scenario where a colleague consistently takes credit for your ideas during meetings. The emotional response might involve confronting them angrily in front of others or complaining to supervisors about their behavior. The strategic response begins with documentation, making note of when your ideas were appropriated and by whom. It continues with direct, private communication. I noticed that in today's meeting you presented my analysis of the quarterly reports as if it were your own work. Moving forward, I need you to either give appropriate credit or avoid using my research. This communication is calm, specific, and focused on future behavior rather than past grievances. If the behavior continues after this clear communication, the strategic response escalates proportionally. This might involve copying relevant supervisors on emails that clearly establish the source of ideas before meetings, or speaking directly with management about the pattern of credit appropriation. The key is that each escalation is proportionate to the offense and focused on solving the problem rather than punishing the offender. The strategic responder understands that consequences need not be dramatic to be effective. Often, the most powerful consequence is simply the withdrawal of cooperation or goodwill. The person who takes credit for your work may find that you no longer share preliminary ideas with them, no longer include them in informal brainstorming sessions, and no longer go out of your way to help them with their projects. These consequences are natural results of their behavior rather than arbitrary punishments, making them difficult to characterize as unfair or vindictive. This approach extends to personal relationships with equal effectiveness. The friend who consistently arrives late to your meetings is communicating, through their actions, that your time has less value than whatever they choose to do instead of honoring their commitment to you. The weak response accepts this message and adjusts expectations accordingly, perhaps by planning to arrive late yourself or building extra time into any plans with this person. The strategic response addresses the pattern directly and implements consequences that make punctuality serve the late person's interests as well as your own. This might begin with a clear conversation. I've noticed that you're typically 15 to 20 minutes late when we make plans. I value our time together, but I also need to respect my own schedule. Going forward, I'll wait 10 minutes for you, and then I'll proceed with whatever we had planned or leave if that's more appropriate. I want you to know this isn't personal, I just need to manage my time consistently. Then, crucially, you follow through. When they arrive late, you proceed as promised. When they complain about your inflexibility, you remind them that punctuality is entirely within their control. The beauty of this approach is that it removes the power struggle from the equation. You are not trying to force them to be punctual, you are simply managing your own time and energy in a way that protects your interests. If they value the relationship enough to adjust their behavior, the problem resolves naturally. If they don't, you have learned something valuable about their priorities and can adjust your investment in the relationship accordingly. The strategic response also requires what Machiavelli understood as proportional escalation, the matching of consequences to the severity and persistence of disrespectful behavior. Minor infractions receive minor consequences, major violations or patterns of repeated disrespect after clear communication warrant stronger responses. This proportionality serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates that you are reasonable rather than vindictive, it preserves your credibility for situations that truly warrant strong responses, and it provides multiple opportunities for the disrespectful person to correct their behavior before facing serious consequences. A single instance of interruption during conversation might be addressed with a simple "I wasn't finished" and then continuing with your thought. Repeated interruption after being asked to let you complete your thoughts might result in your stepping out of conversations where this person is present. Persistent interruption in professional settings after direct communication might warrant a conversation with supervisors about the pattern of disruptive behavior. Each level of response is clearly connected to the severity and persistence of the problem. The strategic approach also recognizes that some relationships are not worth preserving if they cannot exist on terms of mutual respect. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of this approach for those who have been conditioned to prioritize harmony over dignity, but it is essential for long-term well-being. The friend who speaks to you with consistent contempt, the romantic partner who dismisses your feelings and needs, the family member who treats you as their personal target for criticism and judgment, these relationships may not be salvageable if the other person is unwilling to engage with basic standards of respect. The strategic responder approaches such situations with what might be called graduated withdrawal, progressively reducing investment in relationships where disrespect is not addressed after clear communication. This begins with spending less time and emotional energy on the relationship, continues with setting firmer boundaries around acceptable behavior, and may ultimately result in ending the relationship entirely if no improvement occurs. This process is not undertaken lightly or as a first resort, but as a natural consequence of the other person's choices. You do not end relationships to punish poor behavior, but to protect yourself from ongoing harm and to invest your limited time and energy in relationships that provide mutual value and respect. This distinction is crucial, as it keeps the focus on your well-being rather than on changing or controlling others. The strategic response requires considerable emotional discipline, particularly in the early stages of implementation. There will be pushback from those who benefited from your previous acceptance of disrespectful treatment. They may accuse you of being difficult, oversensitive, or changed for the worse. These accusations are predictable and should be understood not as valid criticisms to be internalized, but as evidence that your new boundaries are working. People who genuinely care about your well-being will generally appreciate clearer communication about your needs and expectations, even if they need time to adjust to new patterns of interaction. Those who react with hostility to reasonable boundaries and consequences for disrespectful behavior are providing you with valuable information about their intentions and priorities. Their negative reaction confirms that they were indeed taking advantage of your previous willingness to accept poor treatment, and their unwillingness to adjust their behavior when clearly asked to do so reveals that their commitment to the relationship is contingent on their ability to treat you poorly. The long-term effects of consistent strategic response to disrespect are transformative both for your relationships and for your sense of personal agency. People learn to interact with you differently because they understand that disrespectful behavior will be addressed rather than ignored. This creates more honest, direct communication patterns and eliminates much of the manipulation and testing that characterizes relationships where boundaries are unclear or inconsistently enforced. Perhaps most importantly, the strategic approach breaks the cycle of resentment that builds when disrespect is accepted but not genuinely forgiven. When you address problems as they arise rather than storing them as grievances, you maintain the possibility of positive relationship dynamics even after addressing difficult behavior. The person who learns that you will speak directly about problems but will not hold grudges once they are resolved often becomes more respectful and considerate, as they understand both the standards you maintain and the genuine care you show by addressing problems rather than simply ending relationships. The strategic response to disrespect ultimately serves not just your immediate interests, but the broader goal of creating a culture of mutual respect in all your relationships. When you consistently demonstrate that you value yourself enough to require respectful treatment, you give others permission to do the same. Your modeling of healthy boundaries and proportionate responses to poor behavior often inspires others to improve their own relationship dynamics, creating a positive influence that extends far beyond your immediate circle. Part 3, The Indestructible Self, Mastery Through Internal Sovereignty. The final letter Niccolò Machiavelli wrote before his death contained a passage that his biographers would puzzle over for centuries. In it, he described a dream where he had encountered his own younger self, the ambitious diplomat who once walked the halls of power, desperately seeking the approval of princes and the security of position. In the dream, the older Machiavelli felt not nostalgia for his former influence, but profound pity for the man he had been. I was destroyed so many times by others, he wrote, because I had never learned to destroy the parts of myself that made such destruction possible. Only when I lost everything external did I discover that true power lies in that which cannot be taken, the sovereignty of a mind that needs nothing from others except what it chooses to accept. This letter captures the final transformation that awaits those who successfully navigate the earlier stages of commanding respect, the emergence of what Machiavelli termed the indestructible self. This is not the crude invulnerability of the sociopath, who achieves immunity from others' actions by losing the capacity for genuine connection, but the refined strength of one who can engage fully with others while remaining centered in their own worth and judgment. It is the paradoxical achievement of becoming so internally complete that external validation becomes a pleasant bonus rather than a psychological necessity, and external attack becomes merely information rather than devastation. The journey to this internal sovereignty requires understanding a fundamental principle that confounds those still seeking strength through external means. The more desperately you need specific outcomes from others, their approval, their cooperation, their presence in your life, the more power you give them to manipulate, diminish, and ultimately destroy your peace of mind. This is not an argument for cold detachment or emotional numbness, but for what might be called invested non-attachment, the ability to care deeply about people and outcomes while maintaining the emotional equilibrium to respond wisely regardless of how situations unfold. Consider the difference between two professionals facing criticism from a supervisor. The first, still dependent on external validation for their sense of worth, experiences the criticism as an assault on their fundamental value as a person. Their mind immediately begins the work of either defending against the criticism through rationalization and blame, or accepting it as confirmation of their inadequacy. Either response is emotionally destabilizing and interferes with their ability to assess the criticism objectively and respond constructively. The second professional, having achieved a measure of internal sovereignty, experiences the same criticism as information to be evaluated. They can ask themselves, is this feedback accurate? If so, what can I learn from it? If not, what does it tell me about the supervisor's perspective or priorities? Is there political context I need to understand? How can I respond in a way that advances my professional goals? This objective assessment is possible precisely because their fundamental sense of worth is not dependent on this supervisor's opinion, freeing them to respond strategically rather than emotionally. This internal sovereignty develops through what ancient philosophers called negative visualization, the practice of mentally rehearsing loss in order to achieve genuine appreciation for what you have and genuine preparedness for what you might lose. Machiavelli observed that those who had never contemplated losing their position, wealth, or relationships were invariably destroyed when such losses occurred, not because the losses themselves were necessarily devastating, but because their identity had become so intertwined with these external elements that losing them meant losing themselves. The person developing internal sovereignty regularly contemplates questions that most find uncomfortable. What would I do if I lost my current job? How would I respond if this relationship ended? What would remain of my sense of self if I lost my current social status or financial security? These exercises are not morbid pessimism but practical preparation, like fire drills that ensure you can evacuate safely when emergency strikes. They identify the aspects of your identity and well-being that depend on factors beyond your control, allowing you to gradually shift your sense of security toward elements that remain constant regardless of external circumstances. This process reveals what Machiavelli understood as the distinction between what belongs to you and what is merely on loan from circumstance. Your character, your skills, your knowledge, your capacity for growth and adaptation, these remain with you through every external change. Your position, your wealth, your reputation, others' opinions of you, these are temporary holdings that can be revoked at any moment for reasons that may have nothing to do with your worth or actions. The indestructible self emerges when your primary sense of security and identity shifts toward the permanent elements and away from the temporary ones. This does not mean becoming indifferent to external circumstances, but rather maintaining perspective about their ultimate significance. You can work diligently toward professional success while understanding that your worth is not determined by your job title. You can invest deeply in relationships while knowing that your capacity for love and connection will survive any particular relationship's end. You can pursue financial goals while maintaining confidence in your ability to create value regardless of your current wealth. This inner foundation creates what might be called strategic fearlessness, not the reckless disregard of consequences that characterizes immaturity, but the calculated willingness to accept short-term costs in service of long-term integrity and well-being. When you truly understand that you can survive and rebuild from almost any external loss, you become far more willing to risk those losses in defense of your principles and dignity. The person who has achieved this fearlessness can walk away from jobs that require them to compromise their integrity, even when they need the income. They can end relationships that consistently undermine their well-being, even when they fear being alone. They can speak truth in situations where honesty carries social or professional costs, because they have confidence in their ability to handle whatever consequences arise. This is not because they don't value these external goods, but because they value their internal sovereignty more. This transformation typically involves several distinct phases, each with its own challenges and rewards. The first phase is recognition, becoming consciously aware of the ways in which your emotional state, decision-making, and behavior are currently driven by the need for external validation and the fear of external judgment. This awareness is often uncomfortable, as it reveals the extent to which you may have been living according to others' expectations rather than your own values and goals. The second phase involves experimentation with small acts of independence from external approval. This might mean expressing an unpopular opinion in a low-stakes social setting, declining an invitation you don't truly want to accept, or making a decision based on your judgment rather than others' advice. These experiments build evidence that you can survive and even thrive when acting from internal rather than external motivation. The third phase is integration, developing consistent patterns of decision-making based on internal criteria rather than external pressure. This is where the most significant resistance occurs, both from within yourself and from others who benefited from your previous patterns of accommodation and approval-seeking. Old friends may accuse you of becoming selfish or difficult. Family members may increase pressure to conform to established roles and expectations. Professional colleagues may attempt to manipulate you back into patterns of behavior that served their interests better than yours. The fourth phase is mastery, achieving such internal stability that external pressures simply bounce off without causing internal disruption. At this stage, you can hear criticism, rejection, anger, and disappointment from others without being destabilized by it. You can evaluate such feedback for any useful information it might contain while remaining grounded in your own assessment of your worth and direction. This is perhaps the most liberating achievement possible in human psychology, as it frees enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy previously devoted to managing others' opinions for more productive and fulfilling pursuits. The person who achieves this internal sovereignty discovers something paradoxical: they become far more attractive to others, not less. The desperate neediness that characterizes approval-seeking behavior repels even those who initially enjoy the power it gives them. Conversely, the calm self-possession of someone who likes themselves and feels secure in their worth draws others like a magnet. When your happiness doesn't depend on others' behavior, people relax around you, knowing they don't have to manage your emotions along with their own. When your sense of worth doesn't require their constant validation, they often find themselves offering such validation more freely. This attractiveness extends beyond personal relationships to professional and social contexts. The person who doesn't need a particular job becomes far more likely to be offered that job, as their non-desperate energy communicates competence and confidence. The person who doesn't need to be included in a particular social group often finds themselves welcomed into that group, as their independence signals high value. This is not manipulation or strategy, but a natural consequence of the way human psychology responds to genuine self-possession versus neediness. The final stage of this development involves what might be called compassionate strength, the ability to use your internal sovereignty not for personal advancement alone, but in service of values that transcend self-interest. The person who no longer needs others' approval becomes free to act courageously on behalf of principles and people they care about. They can speak up for those who are being mistreated, even when silence would be safer. They can pursue goals that serve others' well-being, even when such pursuit offers no personal benefit. They can love others fully without the fear of loss that often constrains affection. This compassionate strength represents the highest expression of Machiavelli's insight about destroying the weak self. When you no longer need others to be different than they are in order for you to be okay, you become capable of genuinely loving them as they are while also maintaining clear boundaries about what treatment you will and will not accept. You can offer support without enabling destructive behavior. You can care deeply without becoming controlling. You can invest in others' well-being without sacrificing your own. The indestructible self that emerges from this process is not invulnerable to all harm. Such invulnerability would require cutting yourself off from love, growth, and meaningful engagement with life. Rather, it is indestructible in the sense that its core essence remains intact regardless of external circumstances. Loss, failure, rejection, and even betrayal become experiences to be processed and learned from rather than threats to fundamental identity and worth. This achievement transforms not only how you experience life, but how you impact others' lives. Your modeling of internal sovereignty gives others permission to develop their own independence from external validation. Your refusal to be manipulated by guilt, fear, or shame demonstrates that such manipulation is optional rather than inevitable. Your calm response to others' emotional storms shows them that they too can choose their internal state regardless of external circumstances. The man who destroys his weak self truly becomes indestructible because he has eliminated the primary mechanism by which destruction occurs, the need for external circumstances to be different than they are in order to maintain inner peace. Having achieved internal sovereignty, he can engage fully with a world that remains unpredictable and often difficult, but he can no longer be destroyed by that world because his essential self no longer depends on the world's cooperation for its existence and worth. This is the final gift of Machiavelli's insight, not the creation of another form of armor against life's challenges, but the discovery that no armor is necessary once you understand the indestructible nature of who you actually are beneath all the external roles, achievements, and relationships that can be lost. In destroying the weak self, you don't become something other than human, you become more fully human, capable of engaging with life from a position of strength that serves not only your own well-being, but the well-being of all those whose lives you touch.